8 people, 8 parents. None of them ever hit anyone. None of them ever screamed in public. And every single one of these stories will sound completely ordinary to someone who's never lived inside it, and completely unmistakable to someone who has. Tonight, no long build-ups. Just the stories, one after another, and at the end, what they all have in common. Let's get into it. First up, the parent who was strangely, selectively bad at things.
My father is a retired engineer, sharp, capable, ran a whole department for 30 years. And yet, somehow, from the day I turned 16, he became mysteriously unable to operate a washing machine, book his own doctor's appointments, or understand a single bill that arrived in the post. Not dementia. This was 30 years before any of that. Just a very specific, very convenient helplessness that appeared exactly at the tasks he didn't want to do and never once at the tasks he did. He could still build a shed from scratch. He just couldn't, apparently, ring the dentist. So I did it. Naturally, the way you do when you're the responsible one. I rang the dentist. I sorted his online banking. By 19, I was doing my father's admin alongside my own university work, and it felt almost noble, honestly, being the capable one in the family. It took me embarrassingly long to notice the pattern. He was never incompetent with my mother watching, back before she died. He only became helpless once there was a new person in the house to hand it to. The incompetence wasn't real. It was a job posting, and I'd applied without knowing it. The day it broke was almost funny, looking back. I was on holiday, actually unreachable for once, and he had a genuine mundane problem. The boiler needed servicing, and he solved it himself in about 20 minutes with one phone call. Competently. Efficiently. The way he clearly always could. And when I got back and mentioned it, almost as a joke, he just changed the subject. He didn't even pretend to be surprised at himself. That was the moment I understood it had never been a disability. It had been a delegation, and I'd been paying an admin fee my whole adult life that nobody had ever actually asked me if I wanted to pay.
Next, the parent everyone else swears is wonderful.
Everyone who's ever met my mother describes her the same way, an absolute delight. Warm, hilarious, endlessly generous. She once drove 2 hours to bring soup to a neighbour she barely knew. I used to watch people say these things about her at parties and feel something close to vertigo because I was standing right there and I knew a completely different woman lived in our house the second the front door closed behind the last guest. The switch was instant, and it was silent. Not a slammed door, not a raised voice. That would have at least been evidence. Just a flat, cold quiet that fell over her face the second we were alone, like someone had turned off a light behind her eyes. The warmth she'd been performing for 2 hours at full volume simply switched off, mid-sentence sometimes, the moment the last car pulled out of the driveway. I grew up thinking there must be something specifically wrong with me, because I was apparently the only person on earth who brought out this other person in her. It took my own therapist years later to say the sentence that finally cracked it open: the performance isn't for you. You're not important enough in the room to be performed for. The performance is for everyone else, and you're just the one who has to live in the gap after the curtain falls. I sat with that for a long time, because it explained everything. Why she was never once cruel in front of a witness, not once in 30 years. It was never that she couldn't control it. It was that she never needed to. When no one was watching, who mattered to the performance?
Next, the parent for whom nothing was ever quite enough. When I was 12, the rule was, get straight A's, and your father will finally be proud of you. So, I got straight A's. And the response was, well, plenty of children get good grades. What really matters is a good university. So I got into a good university. And the response was, a degree doesn't mean much these days. What matters is a proper career. So I built a proper career. And the response, when I finally made partner at 31, the thing I'd been quietly chasing since I was a child, was silence. And then, "You always were ambitious. I suppose I hoped you'd have settled down by now too." There was never a finish line. That's the part that took me 20 years to see clearly. Every single time I hit the target he'd set, the target had already moved somewhere just slightly out of reach, dressed up as a completely reasonable new expectation, so it never looked like the goalposts moving. It looked like me simply not being quite there yet. I spent my whole life in a permanent state of almost, and I genuinely believed, for 2 decades, that the almost was about me. That I just needed to try slightly harder, achieve slightly more, and eventually I'd arrive at the place where he was, finally, simply proud. I stopped chasing it the year I turned 35, and it wasn't a decision so much as an exhaustion. I sat down and actually wrote out every single goalpost, in order, on paper, and looked at the list, and understood, properly, for the first time, there was never going to be a version of me that arrived. The goalposts moved because moving them was the entire function. A finish line would have meant he had to actually say the words, "I'm proud of you," and mean them, with nothing left to add afterward. And it turned out he had never once, in 35 years, been willing to do that.
Next, the mother-in-law who loved her son's new wife completely, right up until the wedding was over.
My wife will tell you herself. For the 18 months we were engaged, my mother adored her. Gifts, long lunches, calls just to chat, telling anyone who'd listen how she'd always wanted a daughter. My wife used to say she felt like she'd won a prize. I should have found that a little strange at the time. I didn't. I was just relieved everyone got on. It changed the week after the wedding. Not gradually, almost to the day. The calls just to chat stopped being just to chat. They became forensic. Questions about our finances, our plans, whether we were letting each other do this or that, delivered to me alone without my wife on the line. And when my wife herself called, the warmth was still technically there, but thinner now, more effortful. The way you'd be warm to a co-worker, you decided you didn't actually need to keep charming anymore. The prize had been won. The campaign was over. What I understand now, and wish I'd understood at the time, is that the 18 months of adoration were never about my wife as a person. They were about securing a result, keeping me close, keeping a channel open into my marriage, before the marriage was a fact that could no longer be unhappened. The moment the wedding made her a permanent fixture rather than a variable to be managed, there was nothing left to win, so the charm simply switched off, the way a salesperson stops smiling the second the contract's signed. My wife wasn't loved, she was closed.
Next, the guilt that arrives wearing the language of duty.
In my family, there's a phrase that gets used like a full stop at the end of any argument. A good daughter wouldn't ask her mother that. Not, "You're wrong." Not even, "I disagree." Just the quiet, devastating suggestion that the very fact I was asking the question at all was proof of some failure in my character, my culture, my faith. Take your pick, she used whichever one was closest to hand. I wanted, once, simply not to spend every single holiday at her house. A small thing. A completely normal thing, I now know, for a grown woman with her own family. And the answer wasn't no, and it wasn't even really an argument. It was, I suppose in this family, we still believe in honoring our parents. Clearly, that's an old-fashioned idea to you now. Not a single word about her actual feelings. Just the weight of duty, of faith, of tradition, dropped onto the scale to make sure I lost the argument before I'd even finished making it.
The thing that finally let me put it down was realizing duty was never actually the issue for her. It was leverage. Because when I offered other forms of duty, on my own terms, she wasn't interested. It was never about honoring anyone. It was about whichever word would make me feel the most ashamed of asking for anything at all. Once I saw that the good daughter she kept invoking was simply whichever version of me gave her whatever she wanted that day, it stopped working on me. Not because I stopped loving where I came from, because I finally saw the trick for what it was.
Next, a father who made sure his sons could never quite trust each other.
My brother and I didn't fall out on our own. I want to say that clearly because for 20 years I believed we had, and it nearly cost me the only sibling I've got. What actually happened, we worked out far too late, is that our father told each of us a different story about the other, for decades, quietly, one sentence at a time. He'd tell me my brother thought I was the favorite, resented me for it, talked about me behind my back. And separately, on his own, my brother was being told the exact same thing about me, in reverse. Neither of us ever compared notes, because why would you trust your father's account of your own brother? So we grew up subtly guarded around each other, never quite as close as brothers are supposed to be, each of us privately a little hurt by resentments the other one had supposedly always felt, and never once actually said out loud. It only unraveled at our father's funeral, of all places, when my brother and I, grieving and exhausted, ended up comparing a memory neither of us had ever mentioned to the other. And it matched. Word for word, in reverse, like two halves of a chess move. We sat in a car park afterwards and pieced together 20 years in about an hour, and there was this terrible, quiet grief underneath the anger, because the two of us had never actually had a single real problem with each other. We'd had one problem, and it was upstairs the whole time, sitting between us, making sure we never talked long enough to find that out.
Next, the sentence that sounds exactly like sorry, until you listen to it twice.
My mother has said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," to me more times than I can count, and for years I genuinely thought that was an apology because it's got the shape of one, the words right there in the sentence. It took a stranger actually, a colleague I was venting to point out what she'd actually said. Not, "I'm sorry I did that, I'm sorry you feel that way." She wasn't apologising for anything she'd done. She was expressing polite regret about a malfunction in me. Once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it, and I started collecting them, almost like a grim little hobby. I'm sorry it came across that way. Nothing wrong with what she said, just my faulty reception of it. I'm sorry you're so sensitive about this. The problem relocated entirely into my nervous system. I'm sorry, is this still about that? Not even regret anymore, just faint exhaustion that I hadn't gotten over something she'd never actually addressed. Dozens of these collected over months, and not one of them, not a single one, contained an actual action she was taking responsibility for. The real apology, when it finally arrived, and it did, eventually from someone else entirely, a friend who genuinely wronged me, landed so strangely that I almost didn't recognise it as one. I did that. It was wrong. I'm sorry. No, you feel, no, that way. Nothing routed through my reaction at all. It was so short and so plain that I actually had to ask my friend to say it again, because I'd spent 30 years being handed a very convincing forgery, and I'd never once held the real thing in my hands to compare it to.
And last, the parent who couldn't let anyone else's pain be the biggest thing in the room, including their own child's.
I once tried to tell my mother about a genuinely difficult year, a breakup, a job loss, both at once, the kind of year that flattens you. I got about 4 sentences in, and she nodded and said, "Well, when I was your age, I lost my job, my marriage, and my own mother, all in the same 8 months, and I never had anyone to talk to about it." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. My bad year had lasted 4 sentences before it became the runway for hers. It happened every single time, about anything. A bad breakup became the story of her own divorce. A tough week at work became the story of the 3 jobs she juggled raising us. Even, once, a minor injury. I mentioned I'd hurt my back. Became a 20-minute account of a surgery she'd had in her 20s that nobody appreciated how much she'd suffered through. I used to think this was just a personality quirk, a woman who liked to talk about herself. It took me a long time to see it as something with an actual function. As long as her pain was always the biggest pain in any room, she never had to sit with the discomfort of simply being present for someone else's. What I do now when it happens is something small, and it took me years to allow myself to do it. I just say, gently, "I hear that was really hard for you. I was actually still in the middle of telling you about mine." Sometimes that's enough to redirect it. Often it isn't. And she talks over me anyway, and I've had to make peace with that too. But saying it at all, out loud, was the moment I stopped believing my pain was simply worth less airtime than hers. It was never a competition. She just needed it to be one, so she never had to lose.
8 people, 8 parents, 8 completely different tactics. Pretend helplessness, a public mask, a moving finish line, a courtship that ends the day the contract's signed, guilt dressed as duty, a wedge driven between siblings, an apology with no action inside it, and a pain that always had to be the biggest one in the room. Different shapes. Every one of them does the exact same job. Every single mechanism you heard tonight exists to do one thing: move the weight off the parent and onto the child, while making sure it never looks like that's what's happening. Weaponized incompetence moves the labor. The mask moves the blame. If no one else ever sees it, it can't have happened. Moving goalposts moves the finish line, so the child stays permanently in debt. Love bombing then. Discard moves the affection on and off like a tap the instant it stopped being useful. Guilt as duty moves the argument onto sacred ground where the child isn't allowed to push back. Sibling triangulation moves suspicion sideways, so it never lands on the person who planted it. The non-apology moves the injury into the child's oversensitive imagination. And competitive suffering moves the airtime permanently, so the parent's pain is always, somehow, the realest pain in the house. If you recognized even one of these tonight, here's the thing I want you to take with you. None of these tactics work by being dramatic. They work by being so small, so deniable, so easy to laugh off as, "Oh, that's just how she is." That naming them out loud can feel like you're the one overreacting. You're not. A pattern repeated for 20 years is not a personality quirk. It's a system, and now you've got 8 names for 8 of its favorite moves. That's not nothing. That's where it stops working on you quite so well. Look after yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.